Yes, good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you today to the seminar. My name is Bruno Azeredo. I'll be the host. I'm a professor in manufacturing engineering at Arizona State University. Welcome to the MateriAlZ seminar series. So a little bit about us. This is a seminar series held in partnership between University of Arizona and Arizona State University. We're all materials scientists and enthusiasts, and we want to promote our field. You can find us and follow us on social media, look up our previous seminars. And I also want to briefly just acknowledge my co-organizers, many of which are here today. So we have Ankit, Christina, Marat, and Krishna, and many of the staff members and colleagues who help us put this together. And so welcome, Mahi Charpagne. I hope I have pronounced it correctly.
Yes.
Oh, okay. I put some practice into it. So Dr. Champagne is obtained her PhD in material science at Mainz Paris Tech. With a focus on materials processing. She worked under Professor Natalie Bozzolo. After that, she spent 4.5 years as a postdoc in Teresa Pollock's group at UCSB, working on numerical tools for 3D correlative microscopy to understand microplasticity. Since 2021, she formed her own group as an assistant professor at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. I should say that's my alma mater, so I'm very happy as an alumni to see that. And her group focuses on the design of sustainable high-performance alloys with damage resistance for harsh environments. She's looking at a variety of ways to tailor material properties from its microstructure and using processes such as additive manufacturing. She's recipient of many awards, but a few here that I want to highlight is the best PhD thesis according to the French Society for Materials and Metals. That's quite exciting. And very recently, congratulations, by the way, she received the NSF Career Award. There's actually a tradition in our guests that, between the time we invite them and the time they come, they receive a lot of awards in between. This is quite common. It's like our invitation is a sign of luck. So anyhow, Marie, welcome. Please share your screen. And fortunately, Zoom is not very good at clapping, but we all want you to feel very welcome and feel the warmth of our community.
Thank you, Bruno, for the nice introduction, and thank you to the whole committee for inviting me. I'm, as I mentioned privately to the committee before, I'm a big fan of this seminar. I think it's a great initiative, and especially the fact that you make this publicly available is very beneficial, I think, to our community. So thank you for the efforts and keeping this together. This is a great initiative. So today I'm going to talk about very broadly what we do in my group and what we've been doing for, before when I was a postdoc, right, for the past 5 years or so. And our overall goal is to designing sustainable metallic materials for structural applications. And while that might sound a little bit contradictory, as given that structural materials are not always associated with renewable energy and these kind of topics, I'm going to explore some pathways as to how to make this a possibility. Of course, I have to start by thanking my fantastic collaborators. This is highly collaborative research. And first off, acknowledges my fantastic students here at U of I. Jackson and Evan and Maria and Tiffany, who have been working since almost the very beginning of my research group here. Also my longtime collaborator and partner in crime, J.C. Stoneville, and also some fellow postdocs and researchers from formerly UCSB, Andrew, who has now moved on to Sandia, and also our industrial partner, Bob Heiss. And of course, a long-standing collaboration with UCSB that still goes on. McLean, and Teresa, of course, my advisor for postdoc. And some of the research that I am going to present today was funded by the DOE, Basic Energy Sciences. That was a project led by Irene Bayerlein and Teresa Pollock. All the computational power that we used for this project came from UCSB Center for Scientific Computing. And then some of our own funding. So this is a project together with JC Stemville. And we have the funding from this Energy and Biosciences Institute, and also some funds that I want to acknowledge from recent acquisition of my career award. So I want to thank Jonathan Madison, who's the program manager for this division of NSF. All right, so talking about structural materials, well, you know, the main drawback, I think, of those materials is that they are really designed for high performance, but they're subjected to fatigue, and fatigue is a cyclic loading. And well, we don't think of designing materials that much with respect to fatigue. So I just want, well, before starting, to dive into what materials we can see in our power generation, state-of-the-art power generation methods. This is a gas turbine engine. And so essentially this is a cross section of it where we can see the inside stream of cold air that goes through this whole engine and turns here into hot air at the exhaust. But there is a bunch of reactions that go on in the meantime. So looking at the different parts, right, you have some casing that doesn't really undergo too much mechanical loading, but everything in between is very subjected to very harsh environments, where, as you can guess, we have high temperature, mechanical solicitation, and also exposure to very corrosive environments. And so when we break down the different materials that we see in this turbine engine, we have some aluminum alloys that can really not withstand very high temperature, but that's mostly for the casing. And then as we increase in temperature, there is titanium alloys mostly. So this is going to the compressor stage here, a variety of titanium grades. And then in the hottest parts, we have nickel-based superalloys, which can be polycrystalline, such as Inconel 718, that's very famous, or Hastelloy X, but also some single crystals or directionally solidified structures, which you can find in the hottest sections that most resist creep. And so all these alloys are, of course, subjected to very different things, but one common solicitation that they undergo is fatigue. And so fatigue is this cyclic loading of materials that can be thermomechanical or just mechanical. But over time, this cyclic loading is going to degrade the materials as they're subjected to heating and cooling cycle or power cycles for this gas turbine. And so by looking into breaking down the different parts of this gas turbine, let's start with the hottest part. That's the most exciting part, where we find those nickel-based superalloys. And of course, you can see they are subjected to cyclic stresses and also temperature stress, but temperature oscillations. But I think the most detrimental part is, of course, the stress here. So mechanical fatigue is a huge problem. It's a long-standing problem, like understanding its origin, understanding the linkage between the materials properties and their fatigue performance has been a long-standing question for decades. And I think it's a really difficult question to answer because fatigue is a very much, solving fatigue is pretty much like looking for a needle in a haystack, really. But when we extract one of those turbine disks here in the hottest section and look at where the fatigue cracks actually developed, we find that they are not even located in the region of the disk that was exposed to the highest temperature, but they are rather located towards the edge where you have lower temperatures, or relatively lower, but we find that the temperature only is not the only problem. So the most detrimental areas are actually in the cooler sections of these turbine discs. So that tells us where to look and where fatigue really is critical. And so when we do so, we identify our cracks and look at these initiation sites for fatigue cracks by looking in the SEM, scanning electron microscope. We oftentimes see some crystallographic facets that show up, meaning that there is most likely a linkage between the microstructure and where those facets are in the material's structure at the small scale, and where the early fatigue cracks are going to form. So that's the first hint that fatigue is actually related to the material's microstructure, so the crystalline structure of the materials. And looking at the cooler parts in this gas turbine engine, we have titanium alloys. And when we look at, again, these initiation sites, we again find in pretty much all titanium alloys in recent work where we highlighted this, that the initiation sites are also corresponding with crystallographic facets. So this is an HCP material, and of course the crystallographic facets are very different. Here we're looking at twist boundaries between the basal planes, between two HCP crystals here. And so that's after many cycles, right? You don't have a crack in the first cycle, thankfully. But when we look at what happens in the very first cycle, the first loading cycle, we see that we have a development of what we call here a slip band. And so early on, we have already, this hints towards the fact that early on, we already have some signature of what's going to become a crack eventually when we add cycles. One bad news, though, is that the density of these twist boundaries is very, very low. We have just a handful per square millimeter of material. And anyone who does scanning electron microscopy knows that when we look at 1 millimeter by 1 millimeter in the field of view, this is a huge area. And so again, as I mentioned, this is another problem of finding very fine features that are very hidden and buried in the microstructure. So and over very large areas. So you have this trade-off between trying to find very small features that are very sparsely distributed in microstructures. So that's the challenge that we're facing when we study fatigue. And that's why it takes a long time to kind of solve these kind of issues. But I'm going to show today with new techniques what we learned recently on this problem and how these new techniques are going to drive the design of the next generation of structural materials that hopefully will resist fatigue better. All right, so the first part, of course, is, well, we got to learn from what we have. And conventionally processed materials, well, essentially, we engineered materials quite a bit already. And so what can we learn from studying fatigue and early crack initiation and early damage formation in those materials? We learned a lot recently, so I just want to start on highlighting this so that we all know where we're starting from. And in the second part, I'll highlight how these findings will help us design better materials. Okay, so I mentioned that we have early on in the very first loading cycle already some, not even damage, but some plastic deformation, right, that develops in the material. And I mentioned the term slip band, and I want, before I continue talking about this for roughly 45 minutes, I really want to dwell a little bit onto what that is and what's really a slip band. And here where the slip band results from the motion of dislocations in the crystal lattice. So each dislocation is defined here on this schematic as this half plane that glides on its slip plane. And so as it exits onto the material surface, you have a unit step, a very small atomic extrusion of unit vector B. So that vector has a direction and also an amplitude, and that's characteristic of each material. And when we look at the slip bands, essentially, there are several techniques that we can use to look at them. Here is a transmission scanning electron microscopy. So this is, again, the modern technique, but it's essentially STEM, but in the SEM. and you can see through a thin foil your dislocations. And so here the slip bands are those elongated features where many dislocations have been gliding. So here I've shown the process of one dislocation creating one unit step. But of course, if you have collective motion of dislocation onto the similar slip plane, well, then you get a higher step. So by measuring this step, you can back up how many dislocations actually traveled through the slip band. So now that's looking in cross section again. So we cut this is our surface of material, and we cut a cross section, and we clearly see the extrusions that are formed by the different slip bands resulting from a process in the bulk of the material. So in a nutshell, we have dislocations that glide in the bulk and that exit on the surface and that create mini steps. These steps, I want to make very clear that they're not cracks at this point, they're just extrusion steps and we'll see that some of them eventually turn into crack, but not all of them. So summarizing, this is by looking in transmission. When we take a microtensile specimen and pull on it, we can see, looking from the top of the specimen, those very small extrusion in secondary electrons in the SEM. And these are the signature of a 3D slip band. The slip band is a 3D object, right? So the challenge is, of course, measuring this step. And recently, we have developed, my colleague JC has developed very high resolution digital image correlation to track how these slip bands emanate on the surface and what signature in displacements they bring onto the surface of these microtensile specimens. Maybe you're familiar with the idea of digital image correlation. Basically, on the macro scale, you take your sample, your area of interest, and you deposit a speckle of particles or paint onto the surface. And then as you deform the specimen, you can track how these particles moved onto the surface. And from this, you can back up your strain in 2 dimensions onto the surface. And this is at the macro scale. So this is a commercialized, well accepted technique. But in the scanning electron microscope, we can do similar approach. The main challenge is to have a smaller speckle, right, for higher resolution, and also having a stable electron beam so that we can find those image very well, those particles. And this has been developed, as I mentioned, by my colleague JC over the past 10 years. And this is now a technique that works really well. There are several techniques to get those nanoparticles onto the surface. But essentially, the idea of SEM DIC, so DIC collected in the SEM, is that you just miniaturize all the principle of digital image correlation so that you can image much finer features. And in our case, of course, we're interested in those slip bands, which we can see in secondary electrons. But from electron images, we cannot quantify how many dislocations are actually traveling in that slip band. And so with the new technique that JC developed in collaboration with the French team, they have made these DIC codes tolerant to discontinuities. As you have a slip band that forms here, you get now a discontinuity in your strain field. And the new technique that they developed, which is called heaviside DIC, allows to actually quantify the height of this step and how wide it is. So from this, we can actually back up physics-based information that really represent the reality of what's going on here in those materials, meaning the intensity of the slip band. We can identify the active slip plane, but also the slip direction, and we can even back up the number of dislocations that contributed to the formation of that slip band. So this is now a very powerful technique that we use on a routinely basis, because you can probe very large areas with it, up to several millimeters, and it doesn't take that long. So it's very mature and robust right now. So now that we can map what we're interested in, meaning this discontinuous strain field and those slip bands, well, what question we naturally ask is, what's the linkage with the material microstructure? As you can see here, these planes are related to the orientation of the crystals, and so it's not random stuff, we actually try to understand now how this field of slip bands is connected to the microstructure. So to do this, we need to, of course, map the microstructure, and there are commercially available techniques for this. The most powerful one is electron backscatter diffraction, EBSD. So this is an example of what maps we can acquire with this. Here, each crystal within our region of interest is colored according to what crystal direction is along our loading direction, which is horizontal in this example. And over the past 2 to 3 years, I've developed some data merging capabilities and correlative microscopy tools so that we can accurately recombine these very high resolution digital image correlation maps with EBSD. The challenge is essentially that you collect these two with different detectors on different tilt angles, on different with different beam settings, acceleration voltages, and EBSD is really subjected to a lot of distortions. So it's not something you can just eyeball and do by hand, especially when you collect areas that are of the millimeter size. And so with machine learning and image segmentation tools, I was able to come up with a framework that actually takes DIC images on one hand and EBSD data on the other hand to recombine the location of each slip band into the initial microstructure. And so with this, we have a very robust framework where we can really statistically investigate the slip localization intensity, meaning the intensity of those slip bands as a function of the microstructure in pretty much any material. So the whole workflow is very robust, and we've collected many data sets. The major finding with this framework, given that we had so many materials, was published recently in a high impact journal, where we had found that the fatigue strengths of any metallic alloy that deforms by this process of dislocation slip can actually be predicted by the amplitude of slip localization during the very first loading cycle. So that proves what I was showing initially in the first slides, where I was showing in the first cycle formation of different slip bands. Now that we can measure their intensity over statistically representative areas, we can actually connect this to macroscopic properties such as fatigue strengths, which is what we did here, and find out some universal correlations. So this was published just last year, and I think this is the major finding with this technique. So going back to our idea of mapping the microstructure, well, we can just now, using this idea that you can extract the fatigue strengths of any material without actually doing a fatigue test, by just doing one cycle in tension, well, we're now down to trying to understand how the slip bands form as a function of microstructure. And we did that in a bunch of materials in 2 dimensions and found some correlation. But we thought that, you know, since the dislocations come from the bulk of the material, that it would be more insightful to actually collect the 3D microstructure of the material and map the slip bands in 3 dimensions. And this is very much COVID work here. I want to mention, like, we're all complaining about the COVID, but if COVID didn't happen, I would never have done that. So I came up with this framework that was even more ambitious, where we can reconstruct slip bands in 3 dimensions. So here, using the tool I just introduced a couple slides ago, where we can recombine EBSD and DIC, I extended this framework so that we can combine DIC with not 2D, but 3D EBSD. And it was very convenient in Teresa's group. We have this tri-beam microscope that's now commercialized, but we can really collect very large volumes of 3D materials. So we came up with this very first merged DIC 3D EBSD datasets, which is very, very insightful. It has over 1,000 grains and over 1,500 individual slip bands that are featurized and flagged thanks to image segmentation and machine learning codes. We believe that this dataset is going to be useful to the community. So for this reason, we made it available this year in a dedicated article. And you can actually download this dataset and model it or study it from a theoretical standpoint, if you like. And so what we found with this kind of DIC and 3D EBSD merged data set, well, we can now look for the first time at slip bands in 3 dimensions. And we found that a large fraction of those slip bands actually develops near specific twin boundaries, a specific boundary that we call twin boundaries. These are particular boundaries that form in any FCC material upon annealing, so that's where their name comes from. They're very flat boundaries, and they separate two crystals that are within a particular twin relationship. We found that most slip bands actually form next to these twin boundaries, especially the ones that are coherent, that are very large, so meaning if you have a very large twin plane area, and also the twin boundaries that separate orientation with large difference in directional modulus with respect to the loading direction were actually the most detrimental. And by this, I mean the most intense slip bands were actually located to nearby these twin boundaries. So that tells us where the weak link in pretty much any FCC material is. It's these coherent, large annealing twin boundaries that have this particular orientation in the material. Okay, so now that we know what we have to work on, well, we have first highlighted the linkage between the microstructure and the strain field that we can map in DIC. And we have highlighted that annealing twin boundaries are the weakest link in those microstructure. So by tweaking the microstructure, we're hopeful that we can get rid of very intense slip bands in the microstructure and hopefully increase the fatigue performance. So this is our new paradigm that we came up with that we call slip delocalization. And I'll explain a little bit what this is. But really the idea of this principle is how to design and process better materials so that we get rid of the weakest link in the microstructures. All right, so the principle of this new approach is to minimize slip localization. And as I've mentioned, we have many slip bands that developed in the microstructure. Some of them are harmless and others are really bad for crack initiation. And so if this is the distribution of the intensity of our slip bands and that are number density, well, we usually in like commercially available materials, we have some sort of distribution that looks like this. And the detrimental slip bands are the most intense ones. So these ones lead to early fatigue crack formation, and we want to get rid of them. Now that we know where they are, well, how can we engineer materials that have this kind of distribution, where you have a modified microstructure so that we get rid of this detrimental slip band and favor the formation of smaller slip band of lesser reduced intensity and having more of these smaller slip bands. Of course, we cannot have a distribution that where we just cut off the tail of the orange one, because we have a given amount of plastic deformation that the material is subject to, right? So this is a fixed parameter. So imagine the area under that curve needs to be constant, but we can actually try and switch the curve to the left here so that we don't have those very intense slip bands anymore. So that's our approach. And now that we know where these very bad slip bands are, then we're trying to work on it. So going back to this idea of annealing twins, well, when we look at which ones are bad, so I mentioned they are coherent, large, and separate orientation with particular directional modulus. Well, how can we manufacture materials that either don't have coherent twin boundaries, have lower twin plane area, or maybe like selecting their crystallographic orientation. About the third topic, I just want to mention that all the materials that we're dealing with are texture-free, so this is pretty much hopeless. And we decided not to investigate this because we cannot really control the texture of the material as much, so that we wouldn't have large differences in directional modulus across the twins. Also because we have 4 twin variants per orientation. So this is, I want to say, almost impossible to do. However, we focused on trying to break the coherency of the annealing twins and reducing their twin plane area. And this was done by adapting the thermomechanical processing of our alloys. So this is the first example I want to detail now. We came up with a modified forging sequence for different material, but doesn't matter, another FCC super alloy called the WASP alloy, where we have an adapted process that consists in a first step where we forge our material at high temperature to trigger full recrystallization. So as we are forging at high temperature, we call this dynamic recrystallization because recrystallization is happening dynamically as we deform the material. So we end up with first category of very large grains here that are dynamically recrystallized, meaning that they have some dislocation density. And then we cool down our material and to a lower temperature, but continue deforming it so that we have partial dynamic recrystallization, so a second round of recrystallization. And because we're at lower temperature, the grain boundary mobility is much lower. So we form smaller grains that don't even have time to consume the first initial big grains. These kind of microstructures is actually called necklace microstructure, where you have very large grains that are surrounded by smaller ones. And we end up with this bimodal grain size distribution, as you can see here. Another characteristic of this microstructure is that you have, in the grains that were formed in the first step, large dislocation densities that remain and were added during the step 2. And these high dislocation densities manifest themselves by large lattice rotations. So if here I'm plotting the same, showing the same EBSD map, where you can see that those large grains have large rotation in their meson orientation with respect to the average orientation of the grain. So this is a signature of the presence of geometrically necessary dislocations that are there to accommodate the humongous amount of strain that we put during the second step. On the other hand, you see that the grains, the smaller ones that were formed during step 2, are actually much smaller and also more stress-free, if I may say, given that they're pure blue here. They have more consistent orientation throughout, and they are not subject to very high rotations. The reason why we applied step 2, I just want to comment on this, is to increase the strength. Because if you have a microstructure, of course, that has very large grains, well, the strength goes down. So the second round is there to crank up the strength of this material. So this is another characteristic of those grains. And then looking at what we really are after, meaning the twin boundaries. So we see that in those large grains, of course, we have twin boundaries that formed during step 1. Dynamic recrystallization. However, in the second step, they are very distorted because of these lattice rotations that were added. And so we're looking into how that has affected the coherency of those twin boundaries, because just reminding you that we want to get rid of the large and coherent twin boundaries. And we find that these boundaries, most of them have become incoherent during the step 2, which is good news. Now they're just like random high angle boundaries that are somewhat planar, but not quite coherent anymore. So this is good news for the larger grains. And in the smaller grains, as I mentioned before, the smaller twin boundaries are not as detrimental. They're still coherent, but we think this is not so much of a big deal for shifting or distribution of slip localization events. All right, so we go back and take this microstructure and actually make a dog bone out of it and measure with high resolution digital image correlation. We measure our distribution of slip band intensity. So this is our region of interest. you can see we have this very large grain here in the center, a couple of others that are subject to very high lattice rotations, and then our second population of smaller grains that are more stress-free. When we look at the slip band pattern here, this is the full map. So we mapped a 500 by 600 microns region. You can see the signature of many slip bands. So I just want to remind you here, the more slip bands, the better. We're just barely beyond the yield point here in this material. And we have a lot of slip bands that formed. And we want to look into whether we still have those intense slip bands near twin boundaries. So we have here, for example, one twin boundary and here another one. So in the following, I'm just going to detail what happens near these twin boundaries and how the morphology of the slip bands has changed as a result of this modified process. All right, so because we have correlated data with orientation versus DIC, we actually can look at every single slip band that formed nearby twin boundaries and check how their intensity has evolved in comparison with an equivalent material. So this is comparing with a different material in Incona 718, which has a similar yield strength. So we can roughly compare these two qualitatively. Here on this very complex graph, each point corresponds to an individual slip band that's parallel to a twin boundary. And we're representing on the x-axis the Schmidt factor along the plane of this twin boundary, and the elastic modulus difference, which is a critical parameter to us. And so these are our x and y axes. And then the color of the markers correspond to the intensity of the slip band. So we measure the highest intensity we can see in the slip band and represent this as a function of these two parameters. The size of the marker corresponds to the length of the slip band. So looking at this, and with our modified thermomechanical treatment, we actually want smaller markers and less intense in terms of color scheme. And we indeed have lesser markers. This is a similar area. We had similar amounts or similar density of annealing twins that were prone to forming these slip bands. And we see that indeed we have much smaller markers and also smaller intensity. And of course, the ones that are with high difference in elastic modulus are somewhat still there, but I want to say that they are much less intense. So this is good news for the efficacy of our process. And here you can see that we have, in general, smaller and less intense slip bands near these twin boundaries. So this is a good hint towards the potential success of this approach. And looking at how this happens, really, I just want to detail a few mechanisms really quick. We have identified essentially 4 mechanisms by which slip delocalization happens. So like the disappearance of these very intense slip bands. The first one is directly related to the presence of lattice rotations. And here we just take a snapshot of one of those larger grains where you see we have a hotspot of lattice rotations. And looking at the corresponding DIC map, we see that some slip bands actually just, as we enter this region of lattice rotation, just disappear in intensity. So they decrease in intensity until they disappear. And we can plot along a similar profile on our correlated data set, point-to-point misorientation. So this is our signature of lattice rotation as a function of the slip intensity. And we see clearly that the slip intensity decreases as we go towards this region that's misoriented. So that's the first mechanism, which is good at making slip bands of lower intensity. But of course, we still have a fixed amount of plasticity that this material needs to accommodate. So we found out a second mechanism, which we call stop and go for lack of a better name for now. Essentially, this happens again in those regions of high lattice rotations, where we see that some slip bands not only decrease in intensity, but also you have sometimes the formation of another slip band of also like mild intensity nearby the first one and on a similar slip system. And here are two examples. So we had the first slip band here and the second one that formed after the fact. And here another one and this very mild slip band that came in right nearby. And to try and identify what's the fundamental mechanism behind this, we just go and take a fib lift out to see in depth, like what happens in the bulk of the material, what happens underneath this surface. And we could find actually a lot more dislocation activity than we thought we captured on the IC maps, meaning that we actually have way more slip bands that contain very, very few dislocations underneath the surface. And this is our question as to like what the fundamental mechanism is still in the process of being answered. We can think of either cross slip from one slip band to another, which is kind of difficult to tell from how untangled these slip bands and how compact they are. But that could be one mechanism. The other mechanism that we're thinking about is actually activation of a second source of dislocation just nearby the first slip band. So like from the bottom of the material or the bottom of the grain, having a second slip band that just gets a second source that gets triggered to emit another slip band. So this is still unanswered. It's a very tough question to answer, but I think the fact that we see these kind of mechanisms is very promising with respect to fatigue. Okay, third mechanism that I want to detail really quick is the development of a parallel slip band. And this is illustrated in this pink grain here. We're looking at in this region in particular, where we had the first slip band that formed during, well, early on during loading, and then the second one that formed parallel to it. And again, you see where the second slip band formed. So it has this intensity of slip. The first one actually decreased in intensity, which is a very interesting mechanism to actually distribute much better plastic deformation in this alloy. And finally, we have an extreme event that's very interesting. We call this splitting, and I want to illustrate this in the central grain of the dataset. This is when we have a slip band that splits into many parts, and we can see that this is a direct process or result of the lattice rotations. And all the split parts actually still follow the same slip system, but just the dislocations are distorted onto that plane that's actually like physically distorted. And we have like a breaking apart of initial slip band into many different parts that have much lower intensity. So that's, I think we're still quantifying all the distribution of those slip bands, but we'll find for sure much more slip bands of lower intensity. And by all four processes, we actually decrease overall our slip localization distribution. Okay, so I really wanted to show you some fatigue data today. The test is still running, which is good news, I guess. So more to come. We're hoping to publish these results very soon. But before I wrap up, I just want to finish with another approach that we can use to continue on this path of slip delocalization. What about just having no twins in the microstructure? Because, well, that's more drastic, but I guess why not? Or even less twins. Because we managed to break their coherence or reducing the twin plane area with thermomechanical forging sequences. But actually with additive manufacturing, we get materials that have no twins or very low twin density. So how about we just look at what happens in these materials? And these are actually very promising. Here is an example in AM316L, so another FCC material, where we see again two of these mechanisms that I mentioned before. The first one being attenuation, where you have a slip band that just dies off in the center of the grain. And again, this stop and go mechanism here in a second region of the material. We have not tested this one in fatigue because, well, anyone here who knows, who's working on additive manufacturing knows that there are much worse things in those additive manufactured materials, such as pores and cracks and smaller defects. But I believe that once we manage to minimize the amount of defects, these materials will actually be pretty good in fatigue. All right, but this was on a material that we put zero effort in actually optimizing whatsoever for our slip delocalization approach. And now what we're working on in my lab is actually printing our own alloys. And there is no better way of having your own printer to do that, because we need to spend a lot of time doing this. So we're now printing our own alloys and using this technology of laser direct energy deposition, where we blow powder underneath a laser source, and we build our materials in a laser cladding process, essentially. So this is very recent. We're going to look at the DIC maps of these materials very soon. And now we're just playing around and finding what printing parameters give the best microstructures in those materials. And we installed our printer like 2 weeks ago, so this is very recent, but we're in the process of characterizing the microstructures. And what we have so far is very long, elongated grains that are full of different orientations. And also, of course, you can imagine this one will have high lattice rotations. They have very intricate structures, but the main thing I want to comment on here is that there are no twins. So this is pretty good news. It now just comes down to minimizing the number of defects and the defect density in those materials so that we can engineer their microstructure better. And this is a huge challenge because as we zoom in and look at what's inside those grains, we see very small regions, a lot of low angle grain boundaries, a lot of segregations, a lot of smaller particles, tiny keyholing. So there is a lot more to it, more than characterizing the grain size. And we think that EBSD alone, by characterizing the grain orientation and in its distribution, will not help us too much. So we're looking into optimizing the substructure into those grains. And so I also mentioned that those materials have, of course, no twin density, but as you can see, the grain size is very high in this previous micrograph. And so what we need to work on is techniques to refine it. And when a natural thing that can come to mind is static recrystallization after printing. And there is very, very little fundamental understanding as to how recrystallization happens in those materials. In practice, there are just a handful of articles that were published, but people report very sluggish kinetics, a long incubation time, and a nucleation delay that's also very long, and also a low twin density and a low density overall of nuclei. So this is illustrated in this preliminary data here again, where this is in column 625. And you can see that the distribution of this nuclei for recrystallization is very sparsely distributed. So in order to get this bimodal microstructure like we had in the WASP alloy, it's actually more challenging than we thought. So we're working on this and we're designing new strategies for printing that I like to call print to recrystallize, where we not only print materials that with the aim of having them fully dense, but we print them with the aim of maximizing the number of nucleation sites. So that implies that we need first to understand where nucleation happens. And this is a daunting task because of the very high complexity of the microstructures. So again, maybe in many years we will talk about this again, but I'm hopeful that we can tune our microstructures so that we increase this number density of nuclei and can have refined microstructure that perform better in fatigue. All right, so concluding on this, we've shown that high resolution and large area mapping techniques in correlative electron microscopy have revealed the fundamental origins of fatigue strength that's universal to pretty much any material that deforms with this mechanism of dislocation slip. And which using a combination of 2D and 3D techniques, we found the weak links in FCC materials. And we're now working on innovative manufacturing strategies to increase fatigue strength using these newly found knowledge. So with this, I'm gonna wrap up. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions.
All right, Mahi, thank you for a wonderful talk. I really enjoyed. I feel like I learned a lot too. All right. Do we have any questions? Oh, Christina, go ahead and mute yourself and ask your question. Oh, she's just clapping. Sorry. Let's see. Anybody, any questions?
I have a question.
Go ahead, Peter.
Thanks very much for the nice talk. Actually, a couple of questions. When you talk about the twins distorting, I'm just trying to visualize, and I'm a TEM guy, and we often look at grain boundaries and things like that. So, if you think of like the mirror plane that would run down the twin. So when it distorts, you had said something about it becomes incoherent. Does it still is it still kind of like a twin, or does it restructure and form something else?
That's a very good question. We need to do some more TM, that's for sure. We haven't looked at this scale, but looking from EBSD, we see that it just, well, the twin plane is no longer straight, right? So it's geometrically necessary dislocations that came in, and we still have to look at how these dislocations actually interacted with the plane at first. But I think essentially the curvature of the plane is different.
So it literally looks like you would imagine the simplest interpretation would be, it looks like a twin, but it's curved.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah,
so that would mean it would sort of be compressed on one grain and tensile on one side and compressive on the other side, if it was like that, perhaps.
Probably. And how you can picture it after this process is essentially just a random high angle boundary that has a misorientation close to 60 degrees, but that's pretty much it.
The other, just a follow-up question then, and I apologize if you already said this, I had a slight interruption. So the slip planes, I wasn't exactly clear on the relationship between the slip planes and the twin boundaries. You say that the slip planes are close to the twin boundaries, but I sorry.
Yeah, for sure. I went really fast with this because I look at this all the time, but that's a very fair question. So this is your twin boundary plane right here, and it's inclined. It's the same crystallographically, this is the same 111 plane type as where the slip band develops. So the
it looks, am I reading the image correctly? That's about 100, the slip plane is about 100 nanometers away from the twin boundary plane, is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's what I wanted to find out next. From the nature of the plane, it's actually the same crystallographic nature. So these two are actually parallel, fully parallel, but for some reason that we don't understand just yet, the slip bands actually form close to the actual twin plane, but not on it.
But close, when you say close, to me, if you say 100 nanometers or 50 nanometers, that's like miles away. From an atomic point of view. So it would mean there had to be some strain propagation over quite an extended distance, I guess, which I guess is that how you're maybe imagining it? Or
so how we're interpreting this is essentially this twin here, for example, well, this twin boundary separates crystals that have very high difference in elastic modulus. So from finite element analysis, very simply, if you mesh this grain and like strain it, you would see that there is a high stress concentration near the twin boundary.
Right.
What we don't understand is why the slip band forms close, but still at a given distance from the annealing twin boundary. This we cannot understand just yet.
We work on, and this I promise I'll be quiet. We work on platinum nanoparticles, and we're looking at the effect of things like CO on structural changes in the nanoparticles, and we often see twins forming, which is a wee bit surprising, but they're not very stable. They only form for a few hundredths of a second. They shears and then they sort of shear back again, but it seems as if that's the strain that somehow it's the strain that builds up because of the adsorbates on the surface temporarily relaxes through the formation of a twin, but we're struggling to understand the details struggling to understand the mechanisms in detail. So it's just very interesting that you're having this twin boundary and it's somehow causing the formation of a slip plane some distance away. Huh?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm.
All right, let me bring up.
Thanks. Yeah.
I get your question.
Yeah. Great talk, Marie. So I have a question you might have answered already while you were discussing with Peter. So, so you actually discussed a couple of mechanisms by which slip bands form. They tend to nucleate next to the twins, and then at some times they are sort of nucleating from or forming from the main slip, sort of branching out.
Mm-hmm.
So my first question is, do these processes happen concurrently? And then have you tried to identify the criteria if one is more favorable than the other?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It's a daunting task to do. And I think now that we have statistically representative analysis, we're on the way to, we're looking into this. So we need to look at all those slip bands. Essentially, so I can comment on two things. The first thing is those very intense slip bands here near the twin boundaries are usually the first ones that form as we strain the material. So if you go from zero strain to like the yield point, you'll see these ones developing before yielding in general. And these ones form first. And because they form first, they can increase in intensity and become the most detrimental ones down the line. There is another configuration that we reveal. I have another slide for this. Using this 3D microscopy. Okay, this is this configuration. We also reveal that it's very useful to look at 3D microstructure instead of 2D, because there are some slip bands that we thought just are not connected to the microstructure. So this is our surface here, and we see this slip trace. But when we project it into the volume, we find that it actually emanates from a triple junction. So to understand where every single slip band forms and where it comes from, you need the 3D microstructure and also this high resolution DIC and a lot of slip bands. And we found that a lot of slip bands actually are connected to triple junctions that are buried underneath the surface. And of course, naturally, you can think a triple junction has a high likelihood to connect grains that have high incompatibility when they're strained. And this is something we revealed as well using this 3D BSE and DAC correlation. And no one had seen it before because, of course, you can't see where all slip bands come from if you don't investigate this. But understanding, so this happens concurrently, and understanding how these two interact with one another is not easy, but I think modeling there is going to be the answer.
Okay, thank you.
All right, we have a question from Yazar. You may unmute yourself.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah, Dr. Mary, such a nice talk. So my question is just regarding the 3D work. So I'm just wondering, like, how is this 3D reconstruction of the slip band possible? Because the moment you polish it off, the slip step would vanish, right? So
Absolutely, yes. So again, excellent point, and I'll also have a slide for this that I hope will make more sense. Yeah, okay, so this is what I want to show. All right, so we have here the whole framework, and as you mentioned, you can see the slip trace on the DIC surface, and you have your grain structure on the surface. But of course, as we ablate the material, there is no sign of any plastic activity underneath this surface that we can tell based on like just looking at the data. So the framework that I developed actually takes the slip trace, determines the 1-1-1 plane on which every single slip band is lying for over 1,000 slip bands in the data set. we find automatically what the nature, like which one of the 4 111 planes essentially is active for each slip trace. And since you know that, and you know your local crystallographic orientation, you can actually rotate back this slip plane and represent where it would have landed in the grain. So it's essentially calculating the normal of that plane in 3 dimensions. And given that we have at least 2 points, here the endpoints of the slip band, a normal to a plane plus 1 point that defines fully the plane. So that's how we reconstructed every single slip band in this data set.
Yeah, I got that. Can I ask just one more question?
Yeah.
That is the on the mechanism of slip delocalization.
Yeah.
So near the regions towards the grain boundaries where there is a lattice rotation, it was shown that the slip band kind of vanishes.
Yeah.
So it's like was a slip. I mean, I think that slip didn't occur at that point itself, right? That is the thing. I mean, like there is a lattice or reorientation there, so maybe that orientation is not favorable for that slip to happen.
Yes. Yeah. So we're looking at Schmidt factors and just doing some basic analysis now to understand what goes on.
Okay.
Thank you. I had one question, Mahi. It's more like maybe directed at the students that are here today. I'm just trying to imagine, like you have some sample microscopically, and you mentioned, finding the needle in the haystack. And obviously, as you go into the sample and choose an area and choose a volume and begin all of this, you don't know exactly what you're going to find.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about that process and, maybe at that level, like how are you choosing locations and what guides you in that process? You're like an investigator, right?
Right. Yeah. So how do we pick the region of interest is what you're asking?
Yeah.
Well, actually, the answer is I'm very much an advocate for running non-biased analysis. We don't. So we actually machine our microtensile specimens completely blindly from homogeneous material, we hope. So when you start from a big piece of material, we just machine them. And then we just look at the center of the gauge, and whatever is in there is whatever we investigate. And we looked at the size, like how big of a size we can collect, right? We're kind of, we're dealing with very high resolution data over large areas. We just go for the largest area that we can collect physically with the capabilities that we have. And we just like do this sequentially. So when we map the DIC, we actually take smaller tiles that we then stitch together. So this is not one single image that's captured in the SEM. It takes about 6 hours to collect one of such images, and then run the correlation is another like more time. But essentially, we don't pick any region in particular. We machine our dog bones and we work with what we have right there.
Wonderful. And one more question is regarding the forging process. Do you have any more details on how that's done?
I don't actually. This is all I can tell. Well, essentially, with the understanding roughly how dynamic recrystallization works, the highest, if you work at a higher temperature, you'll get a bigger grain size. And so, well, by looking at this, I can just mentally imagine like the big grains will form first, and then second step, you have smaller grains that just form around them. This is a classic case scenario for dynamic recrystallization, and we know roughly like what's the grain size at the temperature 1, what's the grain size we should have gotten at temperature 2. Essentially, the main challenge here that I comment on is when should you stop at step 2? Because you don't want full dynamic recrystallization at step 2. You don't want those smaller grains to completely invade the bigger grains here that are already there. So this is very much a challenge to do. And this material was provided by our collaborator, and it's quite amazing that they could manage to get a bulk piece of material that has such finely controlled microstructure. So
Yes, wonderful.
that's how it works.
All right, so we want, on behalf of the committee, I want to thank you for your talk. One thing I forgot to mention about Professor Charpagne is her talent as a classical pianist. She has promised us to come back another day and also perform to us. I hope that we can have you again in the near future. Okay, Marie?
Absolutely. Note taken. Thank you again for the invitation.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Bruno.
Thank you.
Thanks, Marie. Bye.